The Model Wife. Oh, Brenda sighed. How could such a simple, everyday routine turn into such a traumatic chore? Harold, she said, as gently as she could.
What?
Came the voice, already a note of irritation in it. Harold, I need to set the table. Silence. No reply. Then,
Oh, for Christ's sake!
Harold yelled with frightening violence.
Look what you're gonna make me do now. Why can't you just fucking well leave me alone?
Brenda had always considered herself a weak woman. She never answered back, and a harsh word would normally make her dissolve into tears. But this was the worst yet. Harold had never spoken to her so vehemently before, not to mention using swear words, and she was beyond tears. She was in shock. It had been going on for 4 weeks now, and she wondered how much longer it would last. How much longer would their marriage last, come to that? The model plane was crushing their life and their love, and it was hard for her to realize that they'd only been married 1 year. This little one-bedroom apartment, which had once represented a love nest, now symbolized a confined living nightmare. In the beginning, mealtimes were a moment shared, a clasped hand across the table, a word of praise for an open tin, time for office news to be exchanged with the latest gossip among the new neighbours. The table had become the centre of their universe, a launching pad for new schemes and dreams, and Brenda blushed when she remembered what they had once used it for. But now, when this madness had started, there had been hundreds of tiny pieces of balsa wood, all numbered and cut out, lying in serried ranks on every surface of the room, including the floor. At first Harold had just been a little annoyed when she had tried to dust and tidy, but now all that was out of the question. Such was his obsession that she didn't dare touch anything. It had been appalling, and her days alone, surrounded by wood and glue, without housework to take her mind off the emptiness that had become her life, had taken its toll. She had tried. God, she had tried. Once in a wickedly uncharacteristic daydream, she had imagined herself vacuuming up the lot. The lovely crunching noise it would make, breaking and splintering as it clattered up the pipe and into the bag. But immediately afterwards she felt ashamed. Now she was just sick with misery. The pieces, little by little, had been assembled into one main fuselage. Fragile in its skeleton form, it had stood with pins sticking in it like some hideous voodoo doll, but still monopolizing the table. Now it just lurked like a menacing, albeit movable, animal, as Harold put the finishing touches to the paintwork. He put down the paintbrush, pushed back his chair, and looked at his creation, and as if nothing had happened, looked up at Brenda and smiled.
Well, my little darling,
he announced.
We'll be flying soon.
Her heart leapt with joy, until she realized that he was talking to the plane. She wanted to die. The following Saturday, Charlie came round as he had done every weekend for the past month, but this time it was to drive them to the disused airfield. They were going to try out Harold's new toy. There were quite a few people around at the old airfield, mostly men, but there were a few sad-looking wives who long ago had ceased to compete with their husband's passion. They sat around on folding chairs with folded arms and folded lips, and stared dully at the men. Brenda watched as Charlie started up Harold's plane. The motor gave out an unbearably high-pitched spluttering whine and started to trundle along the runway, and in no time it was off the ground, leaving behind it an acrid smell which lingered in the air in little blue clouds which caught the back of Brenda's throat. Even though she was coughing, she couldn't take her eyes off the plane, and managed, in spite of everything, to really appreciate how much it looked like a real airplane. Charlie passed the remote control over to an eager but apprehensive Harold for the first time, and after a small dip and lurch, It was obvious by the look on Harold's face that it had all been worth it. Brenda was so absorbed in the execution that she didn't notice Charlie, who had come over and was now standing at her side.
"Amazing stuff, eh, Brenda?"
he said, making her jump.
It certainly is,
she answered, not taking her eyes off the little aircraft.
I had no idea.
"You want to go?"
he asked. Brenda turned round and looked at Charlie in horror.
Oh no, I couldn't. What would Harold say?
Charlie chuckled.
"Nothing. It's my remote control."
Harold argued bitterly with Charlie, but Charlie insisted.
"Oh, come on. She's put up with it for so long. She might as well have a little fun with it too, don't you think?"
Harold turned slightly red and passed the remote control over to Charlie and slunk off like a spoiled child, furious at being separated from the controls after he had so nearly got the hang of it. Brenda was a natural. Charlie had put his arms around her and guided her fingers on the two little joysticks, and in no time she had the little plane leaping and turning somersaults and was completely in charge. The crowd joined her and timidly clapped their appreciation. She hadn't felt this happy for a long time. Harold just stood apart and glared. And then it happened, so quickly. Suddenly the plane was out of control, and even Charlie, who immediately grabbed the remote control, couldn't get it back on course. There was nothing to stop the little plane's nosedive. The whining of the machine grew louder and louder as it plummeted, screeching towards the ground. When it hit, there was no explosion, no flying debris, only a heavy, palpable silence. Charlie tried desperately to explain to the irate Harold that it hadn't been Brenda's fault, but rather the fault of a stronger signal, like an amateur CB radio in the vicinity, for example, which must have picked up the radio waves and taken over. It had been known to happen before. But Harold wouldn't listen. He was inconsolable. He was silent all the way home, but Brenda could see that his knuckles were white, and he was literally gnashing his teeth. That evening he only spoke once, but when he did, he spat out each word with such venom that it was truly alarming.
"I'm going to build another, bigger and better,"
he informed her coldly.
"and you're not getting your filthy little hands on it."
He noticed as he turned away that Brenda had gone white, but because he didn't meet her eyes, he didn't see the look of sheer, undiluted hatred in them. Charlie had been so kind after that dreadful day at the airfield. He'd regularly picked her up on his sorties out there, and had shown her more and more complicated acrobatics with his remote control unit. He'd explained the detailed technical side of things, which had fascinated Brenda. Of course, Harold was only too pleased to get her out of the house. Anything was better than having this zombie standing around sulking and staring at him. 2 months later, Harold and his new model plane were ready. But then, so was Brenda. When Harold was at the office on the Friday, Brenda slid the black box out of its bin bag where she had hidden it under the sink, looked at it and smiled. The remote control was a superior model to Charlie's, and she fingered the buttons with affection for perhaps the 100th time. She hadn't minded digging into her private savings, and its simple presence had helped her put up with the hell that had been life in the apartment-cum-workshop for 8 gruesome weeks. The Saturday arrived, and Brenda was relieved to see that it was a perfect day for it. A little cold, good visibility, but more importantly, no wind. Harold was like a child at Christmas, impatient to show his friends his new toy, and when he proudly presented his monster plane to the group, they gathered round the gleaming new fuselage and made appropriate noises, much to his relish. They had a hard time trying to get it started. Charlie couldn't bring it to life, nor could some of the so-called specialists on the runway, and Brenda started to get nervous. Her heart sank at every failure, but suddenly the beast roared into life, and a cheer went up, and at the same time so did Brenda's morale. She watched the plane as it soared into the sky, and was taken through its paces. It was a beauty, she thought, even better than she had anticipated. She excused herself to no one in particular and headed back to the car. Nobody would ask her where she was going with no public convenience for miles. She extracted a box from under its hiding place in the picnic basket and slipped it under her bulky duffel coat and made for a distant thicket. She squatted behind the bushes and removed the branches that covered the hole that she had dug on previous visits, and set her mind to concentrating on her goal. Nobody could see her, but she had a clear view of the action and prepared her equipment. The moment she tuned into the same wavelength, she heard a reaction from the group as the plane banked recklessly, but soon she had it in hand and put it back on course again, mentally thanking the unsuspecting Charlie for all the hours spent passing his knowledge on to her. She knew she had total control of the thing when Harold started yelling. Charlie attempted to take the controls from him, but he snatched the remote away from his friend as he frantically tried to regain command. Brenda's mouth was dry, but she focused and she guided the plane around with dexterity and soon established a perfect line of fire between the plane and her husband. The crowd started to scatter in panic as the plane approached, and the people were screaming at Harold to get out of the way. But Harold stubbornly stood his ground, trying to bring his baby under control. But it was useless, and with one collective scream from the crowd and a final roar of acceleration from the plane, it smashed into Harold's forehead right between the eyes. The silence was total as Harold collapsed to the ground, and the stunned onlookers stood frozen to the spot. After she had buried the remote control, Brenda's nerves gave way, and it hadn't been too difficult to play the part of the grief-stricken widow. Charlie had been wonderful and had immediately taken her into his care in spite of his own deep distress. She and Charlie had become very close during the 2 months that Harold had spent making what was to be his last plane, and one thing led to another, and consequently, a respectable 9 months after the funeral, Charlie had asked Brenda to marry him. Brenda had accepted on the condition that Charlie give up model aeroplanes. Charlie had agreed, presuming that the memory of them would be too painful for this sweet, gentle woman, and Brenda was happier than she could ever have imagined possible. This time there would be nothing to mar her joy. After a simple wedding at the registry office, they had returned that evening to Charlie's lovely house in the suburbs. Of course, she knew the house, having had it redecorated to her specifications, and was pleased and proud at the result. It was clean, tidy, and roomy, and she could already envisage the arrival of future guests as she led them into her beautifully arranged sitting room. By now it was a time just for them. Charlie took her in his arms and carried her over the threshold in the old-fashioned traditional way, and without putting her down, gave her a long, lingering kiss. It was all so romantic. With her still cradled in his arms, he carried her through the dark hall into the spacious living room.
"Why don't you put the light on, darling?"
she laughed, wriggling in his arms. Charlie chuckled in that little boy's way that she had come to love.
It's a surprise.
He carried her into the room and sat her down on the chintz-covered sofa.
"Ready, Brenda, my darling,"
he said, reaching for the light.
"You're going to love this."
The lights went on, and Brenda sat paralyzed as she stared down at her beautiful new wall-to-wall carpeting, which was now completely covered with endless lengths of electric train tracks.